Welcome to episode 39 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. A few months ago, Sage, my 8-year-old, asked us why people find it so funny to name pigs Kevin, as in Kevin Bacon, she says. We explained to her the actor, which then led to the conversation on 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. You know, the game that challenges people to connect other actors to Kevin Bacon via the shortest path available? Okay, I believe I have digressed already. So, I say all that to say that our conversation led me to think the next day about education, more specifically, how everything is connected. It led me to remember a very enjoyable book I've read, Classroom Management from the Ground Up. This book, written by Todd Whitaker, Madeline Good, and Catherine Whitaker, take us through effective strategies for designing and improving classroom management from the ground up. They do so by using a house metaphor, which shows us how everything is connected back to effective classroom management. To help me out today, I've invited Madeline Good to Anchored in Education. She is going to give us more on the house metaphor, as well as effective practices to becoming an even better educator with more solid classroom management. Madeline, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really looking forward to this chat.
Well, we are excited to have you because we're going to be talking about what I think is just fundamentally one of the most important things in education, which is classroom management. And we're going to get into the book that you authored here, Classroom Management from the Ground Up, in just a second. But before we get started, we'd like to find out a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
Yes, so I grew up in Terre Haute, Indiana. I am a part of an educational family. Both of my parents were teachers and principals and are now university professors. My sister is a teacher in Kansas City, and then I was a teacher for 5 years. I went to school at Vanderbilt University, and then I taught 3rd grade for 3 years in a couple districts in Missouri, and then I taught 8th grade for a couple of years, and now I am a full-time PhD student at the University of Missouri.
So you're still anchored in education, just in a different fashion.
Yes, I always will be, that's for sure.
Absolutely. So today we're talking about classroom management. And as I said, I would argue that quite possibly this is the most important part of education because without it, teaching and learning really doesn't happen. And so in this book, you've used a house metaphor to help us envision classroom management. Can you help our listeners understand this house metaphor?
Yes, so my dad, my sister, and I, the other co-authors of the book, we wanted to create some kind of structure that would make it easier to have discussions about classroom management because, as we all know, classroom management is very multifaceted, and especially with new or beginning teachers or even teachers in the middle of their career that just need to kind of reassess what's going on in their classroom, we wanted to give them a structure that would make it easy to reflect back and think about what's going well and what could be adjusted. And so we came up with a house metaphor for classroom management. When you're wanting to build a house, we argue there are 3 basic aspects. There's going to be the foundation of the house, which we know we need to have a good foundation to have a house that's going to stand strong throughout time. Then you have the actual structure of the house, what it looks like, what it feels like when you walk in. And then lastly is the maintenance of the house. So even if you build like the most beautiful house in 1985, if you don't maintain it and keep it up, then 20 years later, it's not going to be as great as it was in 1985. So comparing that house metaphor to classroom management, the foundation of the house in classroom management are relationships. So to have an effectively managed classroom, we would argue that you have to have a foundation of solid relationships with your students built on mutual respect and trust. The actual structure of the house in regards to classroom management are your high and clear expectations. So, and we really emphasize the concepts of having high expectations because we know that for students to rise to the occasion of being scholars that we know they are, You have to expect them to be that. But then you also have to have clear expectations, because a lot of times in your head, you think you know what students want to do. But if you are not explicit about that to them in a variety of ways, then they may not know that those were what your expectations were. And then lastly, like I said, and to have a house, you have to maintain it. In the classroom, that maintenance is what we call consistency. So even if you have great relationships and even if you have high and clear expectations, if you do not consistently reinforce both the relationships and the expectations, then your classroom management will not be sustainable until the end of the year.
And, as you hear about those three parts that's in this house metaphor, you can't maintain something that you haven't built, and you can't build anything until you have a foundation. And it's going to be neat as we go through our conversation to hear a little bit more in depth on each of those. But something that maybe my listeners cued into here that they didn't hear was effective planning and instruction. And I think it's important that we point out that even before the house metaphor comes the effective planning and instruction. So, a common trap for teachers is what to do when there is downtime. And I can still remember one of the first lessons I taught to my first graders. I severely misjudged the lesson time, and I ended up with a lot of downtime. And I'm sure you, as are many others out there, going, "Oh, I've been there." We've all been there. So,
Right.
in addition to avoiding downtime, what can teachers do to strive toward effective planning and instruction?
So again, making sure you like focus on that downtime really closely, which means that the way like we talk about the first 5 minutes of the lesson is really important. So when you're planning a lesson, you want to make sure that you set the stone from. Whoa, sorry, you set. We want to make sure that you set the tone for the lesson,
Yeah.
like right at the beginning of class, or if you teach elementary school where you have one class all day long, like right at the beginning of whatever the chunk of time that you'll be teaching math or reading or writing or science. And so focusing on those 5 minutes and making sure that you are having students jump in right away will really help set the tone for the rest of the lesson. So that's one aspect of it. Another thing is focusing on student engagement. And this also goes along with, like, we would argue that avoiding downtime goes along with a lot of different aspects of lesson planning and instruction, but specifically in the idea of engagement, we feel like, and again, especially for not only like beginning teachers, but even teachers in the middle of their career that are trying different strategies or being trained on a variety of different strategies, sometimes it can feel like that engagement means that you have to be able to perform like a Shakespearean play for your students every single day if you teach high school English. But we would argue that engagement is much simpler than that. Obviously, if you want to get to that point and you're at that point in your career, go for it. But engagement doesn't have to be that complicated. And it really just means that you have something meaningful that every student can work on throughout every moment of, again, whether it's your class period or your instructional time. And so that doesn't always, like, if you're having to do direct instruction, because sometimes direct instruction is just going to be the most effective way for you to, take 10 minutes and introduce a concept. Instead of just having students sit there and listen to you, maybe they could be filling out a graphic organizer while you're teaching, or maybe they could be taking guided notes. So again, like that level, we would argue that that is just as much engagement as the performing a Shakespearean play every single class period. But it is just a much simpler way to approach it and can be a lot less daunting, especially as teachers and educators today. We are definitely assaulted with a variety of visuals as to what the best teachers look like.
Most definitely. And I want to go back and highlight what you said. Engagement doesn't have to be complicated. And you're right. There is a barrage of examples out there on social media for teachers that makes us think that what we're doing isn't enough or that we need to be doing more, but that's not the case.
Right.
Engagement can be very simple, but what I think the message here is that engagement is important. So no matter how you're bringing it, it's just you got to make sure that it's there. So
Mm-hmm.
in a second, we're going to dive into relationships. I know people are wanting me to get to this foundation of classroom management, but I first want to talk a little bit about tweaks. And so you talk about tweaks in the book, and they're different from resets, which we're going to get to resets in a little bit. But can you tell us what is a tweak and when should we utilize this strategy?
Yes. So tweaks are things that every single teacher uses every single day throughout their entire class period, or whether they have the students all day long throughout their entire day. And a tweak is a small adjustment that you make while you're teaching or interacting with students or planning a lesson or anything like that. It's just a small adjustment that you make based on what you know is going to help improve something in your classroom. And tweaks are things that you just change. You don't have to tell the students that you're changing them. So, for example, like if you are a seventh grade math teacher and you taught your first period and you realize that the way that you handed out the instructional material was extremely, like, it wasted a lot of time,
Yeah.
then for your second period, you do it in a different way. That would be considered a tweak. Again, you didn't have to tell your second period that the way you did it first period was a total flop. Instead, you just did it because that's what effective teachers do, is they make as many, like, they make necessary changes throughout their instructional time that are going, again, help utilize time better and help students learn more effectively.
And tweaks are important. And I think that uh, as we go along in our careers, they happen really just without even thought. It's just something that we do. And so I think what we want to stress to our more beginning teachers is that start thinking of what these tweaks can be. You give great examples in the book, and utilize them. And it's okay. It's okay to make these tweaks.
Right. Well, and again, even like the most veteran teachers and the most successful teachers, I would argue that they make tweaks constantly throughout the day, whether they're conscious of it or not. And then we also, and a couple of the professional developments that we have done, we've also worked with teachers in differentiating, like, in the moment tweaks versus like reflective tweaks. So sometimes you're like in the middle of teaching something and you realize you said something in a way no students understand, so you try to say it in a different way. That would be an in the moment tweak. But sometimes you end the day and you're like, wow, this part of my day was really, really crappy and I couldn't come up with anything better. I'm just going to reflect on it tonight, may do a little Googling, may talk to some of my colleagues, may look on Twitter and see if tomorrow I can tweak that same part of the day. And so you can also, again, do tweaks in the moment, which every single teacher does, but then also there may be tweaks that you have to think about for a little bit before you'll be able to come up with the best solution.
All right, so let's get into the foundation of classroom management. This is relationships. And, we hear this so often, yet it is the one thing that I see breaks down interactions between teacher and student. And we can quickly go through some of the ways to build relationships, but I think the most valuable part of this chapter begins on page 38 when you talk about repairing relationships. So, can we go into that a little bit more?
Yes. So we think that a lot of times people talk about effective ways to build relationships, which is obviously incredibly important. But sometimes it doesn't acknowledge that students are human beings and that teachers are human beings. And so that means that sometimes we're going to make mistakes. And that is okay. Again, there are certain things that we know that we never want to do with students. We never want to, use sarcasm in a mean way. We never want to yell at students. But everybody will have a day where something just doesn't go well and you may get frustrated and you may cross a line that you swore you would never cross, but it just happened because of behavior issues, because of something that happened to you in the morning. Anything can really impact it. But if that happens, it's not the end of the world. You just have to be willing to apologize. And sometimes you have to just apologize to one student, but sometimes you have to apologize to an entire class. And in my career, I have had to do both because, again, sometimes I'll handle a discipline issue with a student and then a little bit later I'll be like, I probably should have handled that differently. So you just go to the student and you just apologize to them. You say, hey, I am so sorry. Earlier today, I got caught up in the moment. I could tell I was frustrated and I just mishandled the situation. And I want to let you know that I am really sorry for what happened. And like I said before, you can also do it with the whole class. And I know my sister has a really good story of this. She shares her first year, she lost her cool with a class And then she thought about it over the weekend. And then that Monday, she walked in and she apologized to them to set the tone and be able to kind of restart their groove. And she overheard a student at the side of the classroom say that they had never had a teacher apologize to them before. And so just never doubt the power of an apology and how that can help repair relationships if they get broken.
Yes, and that story you mentioned of your sister Catherine, that's in the book.
Yes,
Yeah,
and it is a very powerful one.
it most definitely is. We have to be willing to apologize. And you're right. We're all there because we're human. So I've had to do the same as a teacher, as a principal, as a superintendent. And it's going to happen. It's going to happen again, and that's all about the relationships. Is that just working on that repairing and apologizing is strong. So, all right, we have our foundation. It's now built. Let's move on to structure, those high and clear expectations. What I hear most frequently are teachers saying, at this age, they should know how to do this, when in reality, students will never get it right if they aren't taught your expectations. So, take us through procedures and expectations we might not think of as part of the daily routine.
Yeah, so I think you brought up a good point. Like, as a teacher, there are so many things that you'll just assume that students know how to do or know what to do. And that is not 100% fair for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it can be their age level, sometimes it can be family culture, sometimes it can be like if you're teaching in a community that's different from the one you're living with, you may not be aware of certain like customs or traditions that that community has. And so I think it's important to always acknowledge that you should never assume that expectations that you have for certain things will just be inherent to your students.
Yes.
And I'm working with a group of new teachers this year, and I just was talking to one of the new teachers that I'm working with, and she said the biggest thing that she realized after the first 2 weeks of teaching was that she had these procedures in her head, but she didn't realize that the students didn't know about them. And so she realized she didn't tell them where to put their class binders, and so then their class binders ended up just all over the classroom, and she realized she needed to have a specific place for class binders and where to put them. Another teacher I talked to was struggling with students going to the bathroom, and so they would walk up to her and ask to go to the bathroom in the middle of a lesson, and this was happening over and over and over again. And she realized, like, I didn't realize I was going to have to tell them you can't just come up to me and ask to go to the bathroom, like we have a hand signal. And so it's again, even little things like where do you grab a pencil, where do you put your paper, where do you turn things in, how do you line up, or even in high school, how do you communicate to your teacher when you're not in the classroom? Like how do you I know some teachers, they really appreciate when students, say, make sure they don't say like make sure that they have in the email, they say like dear Mr. or dear Mrs. Like they want to help them know those kinds of skills. And so again, you can make assumptions about expectations and rules in your head, but they may not always be in your student's head, and that is okay.
Sure, it is, and it's important to remember that your colleagues at the grade level below you or at a different subject level, they have their own expectations, and so it may be a good time to have a conversation with colleagues to see that you can create consistent expectations, so then students are remaining consistent throughout too. I don't think that's too far out there.
Right. No, I agree. I've been on teams before where they really wanted to make sure that we were on the same page with certain things, especially things that were major issues, like when I taught eighth grade, like cell phone usage. And so they really wanted us to be on the same page. So we all knew that students weren't confused about like what teachers allowed cell phones, which ones didn't, and like what they were supposed to do with them. And I think it's also important. Like I just started my PhD program, and there were even expectations within my PhD program that I didn't realize that were, you join into a new culture, and there are things you didn't realize, certain words you should or shouldn't use, or certain ways you should or shouldn't approach research. And so again, I'm an adult, but I'm still learning expectations. And so that's just kind of a constant thing based on the context that we're existing in.
Oh, absolutely. I think that extending the conversation to expectations can go all levels, from elementary all the way through higher education, and even postdoctoral, like your doctoral, like what you're talking about. So, okay, now we've got a solid structure and it's on a strong foundation. So now it's time to maintain, which in classroom management lingo we'll say consistency. Now, you list very simple go to strategies that are often neglected by teachers. So, help us understand what consistency looks like in the classroom.
So in the classroom, we emphasize that consistency means you are reinforcing either relationships or expectations, or sometimes that is both. So, in regard to relationships, some people see, like, they think, oh, if I just build a relationship with a student in the first week, then we'll be buddy buddy the rest of the year and it'll be fine. But building relationships is like an everyday thing. It's every single interaction you have with a student is either going to help build or tear down that relationship. And so part of consistency is being like consistently being respectful with students and consistently trying to build relationships with students. But then another part of consistency is maintaining those expectations. And in general, when we work with teachers, they would argue that consistency is the hardest part of the classroom management framework. And it's because consistency can be confusing. So when you're trying to be consistent, you need to consistently reinforce like positive behaviors, but then you also need to consistently work to not reinforce those behaviors that you're trying to avoid. And that can be hard because there'll be certain students that if this student blurts out, for a fact they knew that they weren't supposed to blurt out, and that exactly that in that moment you can provide a consequence or a warning or chat with them and it's not a big deal. But then that other students may have a harder time. There may be a student with an IEP or a student with a 504 that you need to, or a student from different cultural backgrounds, and you need to take all of that into consideration. But it's all, we argue, especially if you're just now jumping into the framework, that consistency, you need to focus on what your like one main non-negotiable is as a teacher, and then work to be consistent within that first. So like when I was a teacher, my main non-negotiable was no blurting out, because especially my first year, I had like a really, really chatty class. A bunch of them were like consistently best friends who lived on the same street. And so they would get really excited during lessons, and I realized if students blurted out, like, we could not get through a lesson. And so then I worked really hard to focus on being extremely consistent in regard to blurting out. And then over time you can put in more non-negotiables that you have. But again, if you're just starting out, choose that one that you have to have a well-run classroom, and work to master that one.
And I want to get back to this non-negotiable in just a second, but in talking about the building relationships and maintaining it, it's not a one and done. We don't build that relationship with a student on the first day and then expect it to last. And I think of like our friends, and if we think of our friends outside of education, like we text our friends and we say, hey, how are you doing? Or just we call them, just checking in to see how you're doing. It's the same thing for students. Like, this isn't anything new, but it's what we would apply in our everyday life to apply that to our students as well.
Right.
And
Good point.
so, in talking about that non-negotiable of yours and blurting out, I think that's just a great way to kind of tie all of this together with the house metaphor, and that you build that strong relationship with your students, and you've done that, and then you create an expectation, which is not blurting out, and then you maintain that by reinforcing and staying consistent all throughout. So I think that's just a great way to show that the metaphor of this in the book, it really works. It really does.
Yes, well, and I think it's important also, like when you reflect back as a teacher, you reflect back on the day when you're figuring out, okay, what went well and what didn't go well, and you're trying to problem solve. A lot of times you can go back to one of the three parts of the house metaphor and you can be like, wow, like today I know that my biggest weakness was relationships. Like I didn't smile enough. I didn't ask students how their days were going. Like that was where my big weakness was. And then you can focus on that for the next day. Or again, it could be, ooh, I did not explain my expectations for this assignment enough. Like I want to change that for tomorrow. Again, or consistency. Again, oh, I let certain behaviors slide too much. Like that's what I need to work on. And so it's like once you get the whole picture, then it can be easier to assess things that have gone right or gone wrong, and then decide what you want to do the next day.
Absolutely. So before we go, we have to mention the reset, and we've talked about tweaks earlier. We can do tweaks all day long and all of that, but now resets is not something that we go to when things aren't working. This is a last resort 180-degree turn from where we were going to where we really want to be. So I guess the first question is, how do we know when a reset is needed? And second, why should we only see one or at the most two resets in a year?
So you know that a reset is needed when you feel like there's barely anything well going on in your classroom at all. Like every day you go to school and you have extremely high anxiety, you're struggling just to get through a lesson. You would argue that your classroom is out of control a large portion of the time. And out of control doesn't always mean like kids are literally running around everywhere. A lot of times that can just mean that like virtually no learning is occurring.
Sure.
And this has to also be over a period of time. So we've all had days where, it's the day before winter break and the kids are just a little bit crazy. Like on those days, you may have high anxiety and you may feel like things are out of control. But if in the grand scheme of things, students are generally able to learn in your classroom, then that would not be a reset situation. It has to be something that has been consistent and prevalent over multiple weeks of the school year.
And I don't think that a reset is not associated with poor teaching. I mean, you can reset with
Right,
confidence.
right. A reset really is just when the different, your foundation is weak, your expectations weren't clear, your consistency is not there. And then it's all this kind of whirlwind where you feel like you're failing as a teacher. And then you also mentioned like we can only do this once, maybe twice in a year. And that's because when you're resetting, you're totally resetting the entire classroom culture and climate from whatever day you start the reset. And we all know if we had a teacher and the teacher changed the rules up multiple times in the year, eventually you would just wait for them to do it the next time. You're not really going to take them seriously. And so that's why if you're going to do a reset, you have to make sure you go through everything we outlined in the book and really be thoughtful and methodical about what things aren't going well and how you're going to change them, because we really recommend like only do it once and then just do it once really, really well.
Absolutely. And the book is Classroom Management from the Ground Up. Madeline Good, one of the co-authors with her father and sister. And we thank you so much for joining us on Anchored in Education today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Now, you can find Madeline on Twitter by searching at M. Whitaker Good. You can also learn more about Madeline as well as find a link to her book by visiting escottengland.com and clicking the Read More link under today's episode. Now, before I wrap up, I want to remind you to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. Madeline said that engagement doesn't have to be complicated. I'll take that one step further and say that classroom management doesn't and shouldn't be that complicated either. Talk to any successful educator out there and they will echo what has already been said today about classroom management. Teaching and learning cannot take place if the classroom is not managed properly. And this actually applies to everything. A principal needs to make sure the school aligns with the house metaphor just as the superintendent must do with the district. And this applies in so many areas outside of education as well. Relationships, high and clear expectations, and consistency is the bread and butter, the heart and soul of effectiveness. Without, as Madeline so rightly pointed out, our work is more stressful and full of anxiety when we are at school as opposed to full of energy and excitement. Regardless of how many years you have invested into education, I strongly urge you to read Classroom Management from the Ground Up. I promise you'll learn something for you, but you will also see how you can help out fellow educators who may be struggling. It is important we have this strong classroom management. You'll appreciate it, and so will your students. And don't forget, at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.